Welcome back, everyone, to Section 3 of this explainer. Now, in our previous lesson, we unpacked the overall architecture of GAAP, right? We looked at the rules hierarchy and how the FASB codification is actually structured to get the basic lay of the land. But today we're translating that theory into practice. We're going to figure out how to actually use this massive rulebook. I always say that memorizing every accounting rule is literally impossible, but knowing exactly how to research and apply them, well, that is an accountant's ultimate superpower. By the end of this explainer, you're going to have the exact terminology and the specific step-by-step playbook you need to tackle any accounting question with absolute confidence. Let's get into it. Here's our roadmap for this explainer. We've got to build our foundational vocabulary first, so we'll start with the language of GAAP, then move into application and research terms. After that, we'll contrast public versus private entities, walk through the 5-step research process, and finish up with the golden rule of scope. Okay, let's dive into Section 1, the language of GAAP, core concepts. These are the essential, absolute must-know terms you need to communicate effectively in this field. We have to start with the heavy hitter, the codification. This is the organized library where all current U.S. GAAP lives. It's built and updated by the FASB. But here is the critical thing you need to remember. The codification isn't just some helpful reference book. It is the absolute truth in GAAP. It's the only place to find authoritative GAAP. If you try to rely on an article or a textbook or even a firm guide to justify an accounting treatment without actually tracing it directly back to the codification, you are standing on incredibly thin ice. So let's clearly contrast these two worlds. On one side, we have authoritative guidance. These are the rules you absolutely must follow to be compliant. Like we just said, that's the codification and, if you're a public company, SEC rules. Now, on the flip side, we have non-authoritative guidance. This is your reference material, accounting firm guides, textbooks, and even the FASB's own conceptual framework. Now, don't get me wrong, non-authoritative guidance is incredibly helpful for understanding complex concepts, but it cannot stand alone. You simply cannot justify an accounting treatment solely based on non-authoritative sources. The actual rules you must follow, those live firmly in that authoritative column. Next up is the ASU, which stands for Accounting Standards Update. Whenever the FASB wants to change a rule, add a new one, or just clarify something, they issue an ASU. Honestly, the best way to think of an ASU is like a software patch for an app on your phone. It's a formal change, but once that effective date hits and the patch is installed, it's completely absorbed into the main system, the codification. After that point, the ASU just becomes historical background. You aren't really researching the ASU anymore, you're researching the newly updated codification. Moving right along to Section 2. Application and research terms, the action words. We've got our nouns down, so let's transition to the verbs. These describe what we actually do with the transaction and our research toolkit. The life cycle of any transaction basically follows 3 phases. First up, recognition. Think of this as the formal birth of the transaction in the financial statements. It's the exact point when an item is officially recorded. Next is measurement. Once we know we actually need to record it, measurement tells us the dollar amount to record it at, whether that's the initial day 1 amount or an updated value later on. And finally, disclosure. This is all that explanatory information that goes into the footnotes to give the numbers real context. Recognition, measurement, disclosure. You're going to see these 3 phases in almost every single GAAP topic. Now listen closely, because we need to talk about one of the most dangerous traps in accounting research, the scope exception. A scope exception is a transaction or an entity type that is explicitly excluded from a topic, even though on the surface it looks like it perfectly belongs there. Missing a scope exception has grave consequences. If you miss it, you'll spend hours applying the entirely wrong accounting rule, which can, quite literally, blow up the balance sheet. You always have to check to see if your transaction got kicked out of the topic by a scope exception. Sometimes, though, there's just no specific rule for a transaction. When that happens, you might look to analogy, which is using rules from a similar area, or industry practice, relying on treatments widely used across your industry. But let me warn you, this is dangerous territory. These are your absolute lowest priority fallbacks. You cannot just guess. Relying on analogy or industry practice requires strict, documented justification in a formal written memo, and it always requires manager approval, no exceptions. Let's pivot to Section 3, public versus private entities. Who is playing the game? Because the rules of the game fundamentally change depending on who's actually playing it. Not all companies are treated the same under GAAP. On one side, we have private companies. These are entities whose shares aren't traded on a public exchange, so they don't have to file with the SEC. Because of this, private companies are actually allowed to use certain simplified GAAP options. On the other side, we have public business entities. These companies have securities trading on recognized exchanges and are heavily watched by the SEC, the government regulator. Because the general public is investing their money in them, they face much stricter rules, heavier disclosure requirements, and they're forced to adopt new accounting standards way earlier than private companies. You have to always know exactly which type of entity you were researching for. All right, Section 4, the 5-step research process, the playbook. Team, this is where the rubber meets the road. I want you to really focus in here because we're entering the most actionable part of this explainer. When you face a new or unusual accounting question, you need a consistent methodology. This is the sequential process you must follow every single time. Step 1, define the transaction clearly based on its economic substance, not just its legal form. If your description is vague here, your final conclusion is going to be wrong. Step 2, search the codification for the most directly related topic. And, crucially, check the scope before you read anything else. Step 3, apply the specific rule to your transaction and record your conclusion with the exact paragraph citation. And hey, stop right here if you find a clear authoritative answer. But if and only if there is no specific rule, you move to Step 4, apply by analogy to the most economically similar topic. If that fails, Step 5 is using the conceptual framework or industry practice. So the crucial point is understanding where you actually want to be on that 5-step list. Step 3, that's the sweet spot. The vast majority of all accounting questions are fully resolved right there at Step 3, with a clear, specific rule from the codification. Steps 4 and 5 represent the danger zone. They're rare, they represent areas with no specific rules, and as we discussed earlier, stepping into 4 or 5 requires immediate escalation to your team lead or manager. And finally, Section 5, the golden rule of scope, the absolute most important takeaway. We've arrived at the climax of this explainer. If you remember absolutely nothing else from our time today, you must remember this. This is the one foundational rule that, if ignored, completely breaks the entire 5-step process we just covered. Now, what's really interesting here is this single number -15. The -15 section in the codification is your absolute best friend. It's the scope section. You must always, without exception, read the -15 scope section before reading any other rule in a topic. Why is -15 so important? Well, because a topic title alone is never ever enough to go on. The scope section defines the exact boundaries of your research. It explicitly tells you which types of entities the rule applies to. It tells you exactly which types of transactions are covered. And perhaps most importantly, it lists which transactions are explicitly excluded, those highly dangerous scope exceptions we talked about earlier. It might even tell you that your specific transaction is covered by a completely different rule altogether. Simply put, never skip the scope. I've got a quick bonus number for you as well, -65. This is the transition section. When a client is adopting a brand new standard, like when one of those ASUs becomes effective, the -65 section is exactly where you go. It tells you the effective date, the transition methods available for moving from the old rule to the new one, any practical shortcuts you're allowed to take, and the extra disclosures required in the year of adoption. It's super helpful. So I want to leave you with this provocative thought. Is skipping the scope section secretly leading you to non-authoritative dead ends and the completely wrong accounting rules? Well, the answer is almost certainly yes. Checking the scope is the ultimate safeguard of that 5-step research process. In our next explainer, we're going to look at what happens when the rulebook truly has no answer, and we'll unpack the most frequent research errors professionals make out in the wild. Until then, keep these concepts fresh, stick to the authoritative guidance, and always, always read -15 first. Thanks for joining me, and I'll catch you in the next one.